So I'm going to experiment with something I've never done before, and I thought it would be fun to have you watch me do this. This board is gessoed with Liquitex super heavy gesso. And now I'm going to apply this plaster over it. So this is going to be giving me an interesting undertone. So I'm just applying it randomly with this palette knife, and I want to have it be not too thick or too thin. Ooh, this is really nice. I have to say I really like the feel of this. And I put the gesso on before I put the plaster on, so that I would be sure that this plaster would adhere. I may want to get some of this to go over some of the old walls in my house. Now you may notice that I have gessoed and taped the edges to protect them from the plaster. The first thing I'm going to experiment with in terms of texture is some cheesecloth. I'm just going to pat it in and see what happens. Oh, that's pretty cool. Okay, let's see. This is a crusty old comb. I'm going to try that. See if I like that. But I am going to smooth that out a little bit, leaving some of the cheesecloth texture and covering some of it up. Now any texture I put down here will live with me through the whole piece. I have two other 12 by 12 panels prepared with gesso and tape on the side. I'm curious what would happen to the color of this plaster if I add some dry pigment. And when I use pigment, I'm always very careful to not let the pigment spill all over the studio and get in my lungs. So this is adding definitely some white that makes this color lighter. But I want to add a little more plaster to it because it seems like it also stiffens the plaster. So I'm going to try next some pigment that I got when I taught in Italy last year. This is called Lake Rose, Rose Lake, I guess we would call it. So let's see what this does if I mix it with the natural color of the plaster, this wheat color, and the white that I already added. Now that's pretty interesting. Takes a while to get it mixed up, and I may want to add a little bit more plaster again so it doesn't get too stiff. Okay, so now I'm going to try this on another desolate panel. It's not completely even as far as color, which I actually like. It's going to look a lot more natural that way, I think. And adding the pigment makes this plaster somewhat less sticky and a little easier to apply. So let's mix some of the straight plaster and some of the rosy plaster. And this will all be in undercolor, but it'll be interesting to see how it affects the final layers. Well, I like that experiment of adding pigment to the plaster. Here's my dog chew toy that you may have seen if you watch some of my other tutorials. Again, this is going to stay with me, so I want to do it with a pretty light hand. So another question I have that won't be answered right away, but I will tell you the answer when it comes, is how long this will take to dry. So our plastered panels are dry now, and I found out it really doesn't take very long for them to dry at all. So you can see a lot of variations in the colors that I used on this piece. But one thing that's interesting to me is that the pieces turned out much lighter. The original color of the Venetian plaster is much lighter, which explains to me now why I chose that color, because when I first saw it and it looked like this, I was a bit taken aback and thought, why did I pick that? But unlike the other kind of Venetian plaster, which I always just use in white, and it looks just the same, this turned out very differently once it was dry. Here's another one of the pieces. Now you can see some places that aren't dry on here, and you can see the difference in the color. And the reason I have places that aren't dry is because this is the piece that I put the thickest plaster on, and as it turned out, I put it too thickly so that it came off in a few places. It cracked, and I don't really want to risk cracking underneath the painting, so I have put additional plaster on to repair those areas. And I left one little piece. You can see it right here. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that one in front of you, and hopefully that will fix the cracks, and when we're finished, the new plaster will be the same color as the old. There's another little tiny place. Probably the little tiny ones wouldn't really matter, but I don't want any bigger ones for sure. But let's put that aside to dry. And come back to this piece. I'm going to try another experiment just because this is a season for experiments. Here I have some Dr. P.H. Martin's Radiant Concentrated Watercolor. And I'm going to try mixing that with the plaster to see what happens. So I'm putting down a little plaster, and I'm going to add some of this amber yellow. Which really gives a different color to this. I can also try some black mixed with the original color. I'm just interested in ways to kind of add color to the plaster layer, and a lot of people do that using acrylic, which is fine. I am not crazy about acrylic, and that's no insult to anybody who uses it and likes it. It just isn't kind of my thing anymore. So that's why I'm trying a water medium that is not acrylic, that I can mix with the plaster. Not really being very thoughtful in any way, just kind of mixing it up to see what happens. I'm also wondering what would happen if I put this color directly on the plaster. I don't know the answer to any of these questions yet. We're going to find out. I'm guessing it's really going to soak in. Yes. You can still see the pink color underneath, but it does some really nice variegated staining that is fun. My guess is that that'll really soak in. Now what I don't know is if that color on the plaster is going to fade as well as the plaster itself. It really feels dry already, but that's another interesting way to go before we add oil and cold wax. This is a woody pencil by Stabilo. Come in all different colors. So this is another way to kind of activate your painting, get some stuff happening early on. This piece is dry now, and the areas where I put the watercolors haven't lost any color, nor have the areas where I mix the watercolor with the plaster. So I'm going to start with a transparent color. This is a green Still de Grain by Sennelier. And I want to put it on so that some of the previous plaster layer can show through. I'm making some areas thicker than others. And I like how the orange and the pink show through. This is some asphaltum by Gamblin. I like the way when I pull this back to a thinner amount of paint, some of the previous layer of green shows through. So I want to show a little bit of close-up of how the texture in the plaster shows and adds richness to this layer. I'm finding that as I experiment with pulling away different areas, I can control how the previous layers show. I like this pink along with the golden watercolor. I like the way that looks now. So I'm thinking about what kind of colors to use above it, and I've mixed up some paint that's a very similar color but a bit cooler to try. But that looks a little heavy to me. So I'm going to rub it in. And just use it very lightly. Putting in some additional wax. Here I've put down a transparent area on the piece where I did the repairs, where the plaster had cracked in a few places. So let's try this quinacridone red just to see what happens. But we want to put on our first layer. And again, I'm going to put this tissue paper down and roll this and see if that brings up some of the texture that's in the plaster. Yeah, it does. So, yeah, that's really soaking in there. That plaster really likes to have the paint soak into it. So I won't want to do too much until I let this dry, but I'm going to go ahead and do some incising. And put that aside. Here's our final piece, and this has quite a bit of texture in it. A lot of it made with the dog chew tool. Here I'm going to use what's left of an R&F pigment stick. This is a very transparent, beautiful orange. Some hints of the pink underneath come through, as well as areas where the plaster is its natural color. Add some white here. Just for fun. Oh, got some dark. I kind of like that dark, so let's go with that. Okay, that's good playing around for the first oil and cold wax layer. I'm also thinking that I can do a bit of scraping if I want to, if there are areas that I don't like. And it doesn't seem to go too far down to, it doesn't go down to the gesso. This is pretty good just to let it dry. It will go through many more changes, but that's where it is right now. I let these 3 panels with the gesso plaster and the first layer of paint dry overnight, and it's about mid-morning now, and they aren't completely dry, but they're really well set up. And by set up, that means that there may be a little bit of paint color coming off when you put your finger across the surface, but it may be dry enough to do a little more work on these. I'm very much liking this piece. I put on a little bit more black over here, and I'm going to see if it's dry enough to use this woody pencil, and if it's not, I'm going to use an RNF pigment stick. Yeah, I can get some marks there. And I may do some more work on this, but one of the things that I'm realizing is if I kind of like this first layer or a couple of layers, then I could leave the piece like this, just let it completely dry, and then put a clear coat of cold wax on it. I think that having the plaster underneath gives a sense of more layers than it probably actually has, but it has that same look about it. So if you want to do kind of a quick sketch, but want to do it on panel rather than paper, this might be a good way to go. This is the second piece we worked on yesterday, and I rubbed some odorless mineral spirits into this piece. It was pretty well set up, but I wanted to give it a more aged look. And I'm going to try just a bit of this kind of a nickel yellow mixture that I created. And I'm going to put some black pigment stick here too. This will take longer than the oil and cold wax to dry, but it may be sped up to some extent by the plaster. Let's try a little more pigment stick. I usually do better when I don't think about things too much. This is not going to be a final design like the one I just showed you could be. Sometimes it happens quickly and sometimes it doesn't. Although this is getting more interesting. Oh, I really like that green over the opaque yellow. That's nice. Okay, definitely in process, but it's time to let that dry. And here's the third piece that we worked on. So I think it could be close to actually becoming something finished, or it could go ahead and have a whole lot of other layers. I hope you've enjoyed my experiments here with Grassello, whole wheat, Vermilux Italian lime plaster. I have some other things, experiments that I would like to try with this, so I will probably do another tutorial on that. And I will see you later. Thanks for watching.